Good morning and welcome to the latest in Chem Safety's webinar series. If you're watching our webinar live, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen where you can post any questions, and I'll be answering these at the end of the session, but feel free to post them as we go through. Our details will be on the follow-up email, which will also include a link to the recording of today's session and some online resources. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Janet Connochie, and I'm a Director and Senior Consultant at Chem Safety, specialising in hazardous substances for over 20 years. What we're going to be looking at today is emergency response plans. What are they? Why are we testing them? And how can we test them? Wanting to make sure we're making the most of this compliance that we need to do, but for a very, very good and important reason. So why have I chosen this as a topic for today? In our compliance certification work, location compliance certification in particular, one of the most common items we come across that's not up to date is the testing of your emergency response plans. And so this can result in a conditional certificate being issued, which leaves you in a compliance state, and it gives you a bit of time to get this plan tested, but it unnecessarily complicates the process and leaves it going backwards and forwards. Too often we find that the driver for doing your emergency response plan testing is the location compliance certificate inspection, whereas if it was on its own or a different schedule, when we turn up to do our inspection, the emergency response plan testing would have been done already. And so we want to make sure that the value that you're getting out of your emergency response plan and your testing is something that you're doing for its own sake and for your value, not just because we're coming along to inspect it. When we're thinking about the emergency plans that you might have for your business, there are several types of plans and emergencies that come to mind. So you might have, there are a number of legislative requirements for workplaces to have emergency procedures, and we'll have a brief look at each of these just now. Most sites will have an evacuation scheme. So this is coming from the Fire and Emergency New Zealand, the Fire Safety Evacuation Procedures and Evacuation Scheme regulations. This is all about how your building will be safely evacuated in the event of a fire. So it's all about getting people out and preserving life in the event of a fire. You're probably familiar with these. You'll usually have trial evacuations that are undertaken every 6 months, and there's an online portal for managing your scheme and testing. If you're triggering a hazardous substance emergency response plan, you will also require an evacuation scheme. Both criteria have thresholds for the quantity of hazardous substances that require an evacuation scheme or an emergency response plan. And the evacuation scheme threshold is around about 10% of the threshold for an emergency response plan under the hazardous substance regulations. There are other triggers for an evacuation scheme, such as the quantity or the number of people that you have working there and relating to other occupancies that you have in your building. The General Risk and Workplace Management Regulations give us emergency planning required for all workplaces and looks at all emergencies that might arise on your site. And so it could include any of these, like fire, earthquake, spills, medical emergencies, severe weather events, which obviously we've been seeing a lot of recently, but also I've seen ones relating to plane crashes where the business is operating in a flight path near an airport or something like that. And obviously we've seen what needs to be covered in a pandemic. For your emergency procedures under these regulations, one of the requirements is when you're putting your plan together that you define when you want to be testing these, so that it doesn't have to be on a 6-monthly or an annual schedule, but you should include in your plans how often different aspects need to be tested. We have the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, and the regional civil defence emergency management groups looking at emergencies at a national, regional and local level. And they are representing the integrated approach to civil defence emergency management. The philosophy, or one of the philosophies behind this, is the 4 R's: reduction, readiness, response and recovery. So what can we do to reduce the likelihood or the severity of an emergency? Are we prepared for it? How are we going to respond for it? And how are we going to get back to recovery? And obviously we're in that phase after Gabrielle at this moment. You can use this approach in your own planning for every emergency that you're dealing with. There are aspects of civil defence that do relate to the workplace, and the NEMA website has good information on those. But what we're going to focus on today is the requirements for emergency response plans under the Health and Safety at Work Hazardous Substance Regulations. So if you exceed threshold quantities, then you need to have an emergency response plan that relates to how you're going to address emergencies relating to hazardous substances. These plans need to be tested at least every 12 months or within 3 months of making changes to these. And there's some good information on WorkSafe's hazardous substance website, hazardoussubstances.govt.nz. And we'll be looking at bits of this emergency plan as we go through. The thresholds for needing an emergency response plan, they do vary depending on what classes of substances you've got. So if you were storing a lot of petrol or solvents, if you had more than 1,000 litres, you would need a hazardous substance emergency response plan. Bearing in mind that you've also already got your emergency procedures to cover general emergencies. So one of the frequently asked questions we have is the WorkSafe Flipchart enough? And I've often said that the Flipchart is great if you don't need a hazardous substance and emergency response plan. So they do provide an excellent resource to have to hand, the WorkSafe or other Flipcharts. And in some cases, it may be sufficient. For example, if you just have LPG for heating, or you've only got 1 or 2 substances or 1 or 2 classes of substances, and you're not doing anything particularly complicated with them. But as sites get more and more complex with either process or variety of substances, there will need to be a more detailed set of emergency plans. Flipcharts may form part of your frontline information, supporting a more detailed set of site-specific procedures. And we'll see as we go through what needs to be in an emergency response plan that, depending on your complexity, there can be a lot of information that you need to pull together, and if that wasn't a flip chart, it would become unusable. So, testing your emergency response plan. Part 1, why? Why do we test our emergency response plan? Like any health and safety documentation, it's no use if you get it, print it, stick it in a folder and stick it on your shelf. So we need to use it. One of the requirements in the regulations is that the PCBU actually activates their emergency response plan in the event of an emergency. You'd like to think that would go without saying, but it is clearly stated that you can't just have one and not use it. So we are testing because we want to know that the plan will work if we follow it in an emergency. Do our people know what they need to do? Are all the contact details correct, or have your neighbours changed 4 times since it was written? Is the equipment ready for use and in the right place? And are our documentation and inventories accurate? We're wanting to demonstrate with our testing that every part of the plan is workable and effective. And so we're wanting to identify the difference between what the plan says and what people will do. And if there's a difference between those 2 things, is it because the plan needs to be changed, or the people need to have more training? Do we need different equipment? It's really to make sure that they are up to date and fit for purpose. If there's a real incident, if you've practiced what you need to do, then your response goes much more smoothly. So let's have a look at what should be in your plan and what we need to be testing. And as we go through these items of what needs to be in the plan, think about what we need to do to verify or test that the plan actually covers these, that it includes them, that they're up to date. When you're looking at these, do a lot of what if questions. The content of your hazardous substance emergency response plan is specified in the regulations, and it can be broken down into these 5 key areas. So identifying the emergencies, detailing the actions we need to take, what people need to do, the role that people have there, specific details about the site and the substances, and information available to us and to other people helping us. I usually try to avoid putting whole blocks of regulations onto the screen when I'm doing these presentations, but I do want to look at this key part here. So our emergency response plan must describe and apply to all reasonably foreseeable emergencies. So we're looking at identifying the scenarios, the substances, the scale and the consequential impacts of what could happen. So could a fire occur? Is it going to be substantially bigger than it would be if it was just the premises without your hazardous substances present? If there can be a spill, is the greatest spill that's likely to happen a 20-litre container, a 1-litre container, a 1,000-litre IBC, or do you have a 20,000-litre tank that could fail? So looking at the different scenarios, it's not just a spill. And also have a think about the consequential impact. So if you've got a spill of a flammable liquid, then the risk of fire skyrockets because you've got vapor available. So making sure we're taking that into account as well. We need to look at the reasonably foreseeable emergencies. So my what if approach works really well here. So what if this happens, what if that happens, and then what? We need to identify these emergencies that arise from a breach or failure of the controls on your hazardous substances. And we'll have a look at some of the examples of the controls. But when we talk about controls, we're basically looking at what the rules say, what the regulations are, what do we have in place to prevent the adverse effect from our hazardous substances. And looking at, it says any hazardous substance present or likely to be present, and we've got that threshold that's triggering this in the first place there. So as part of our testing, we need to verify that we've identified and properly described what emergencies are relevant to our workplace. Here are some examples of some of the controls that the regulation has and what the potential consequences could be. So there's a control around making sure that your hazardous substances are labelled correctly and remain labelled. If that falls down, then we've got potentially unknown substances. It's probably not going to be an emergency, but if it's not addressed and suddenly you've got a number of different products that we don't know what they are, and an earthquake occurs, and now they're muddled up, they're no longer on the shelf where someone knew what that was, but the label was missing. If packaging fails, then we can have a leak or a spill. That's definitely one of our emergency scenarios. We need to keep certain substances locked up so that unauthorised people can't access them. And so if there's a failure in the security there, then there is the potential for malicious or unknowingly incompetent activity to occur for those. That may or may not be an emergency scenario, and is something that you would need to consider for your specific substances. To take a particular example there, if it was a storage area for 1080, if the security failed there, then there's a known activism group or potentially people who would want to do something malicious with that. Common control for all substances is keeping segregation of incompatible substances in place, and if that's not done, we can have reactions, fumes, heats, fire, definitely results in an emergency. And also you can have reaction and fire happening without incompatible substances for things like organic peroxide. So again, making sure that we're aware of what can happen with those. If we don't keep ignition sources away, we're going to have a fire. clearly an emergency. If our secondary containment fails, then we do have the potential for release to uncontained areas. One of the ideal scenarios in an emergency is that you can actually stop, step back, and have some time to consider what you need to do. So if you've had a spill into your bund, it's not going anywhere, you can think about it. But if the bund was full of rainwater and you had a spill into it and now you don't have enough capacity, then you've got a wider release you need to deal with. If we don't have the correct PPE or the actual controls on the process aren't working, we can have worker exposure to substances that can lead to first aid and health adverse effects, and that can definitely be an emergency. And similarly, if we get elevated temperature for substances that need temperature control. A whole lot of examples there of things that you need to consider and that can build into your emergency procedures. Why are we doing X, Y, Z to prevent something from happening? After we've identified our emergencies, we need to describe which actions to take. We need to describe how we're going to warn people. So have we got the right contact details up to date? Have we got alarm systems that we can use? How do those work? Who has control of those? Depending on the size of your site, then you may need to have telecommunications being involved in this to get everyone notified correctly. We need to advise what actions people need to take to be safe. Is that evacuate, where to go to, and if it's a staged control, making sure that people are aware that something's happening on site and everything's okay at the moment, but things may change as the scenario develops. We need to know what to do to help or treat injured people, and we need to manage our emergency. We're wanting to restrict the affected area of the emergency and reduce the severity of it. So the scenarios you've got to think of, what are we going to do to make this as small as possible once it's happened? And lastly there, we need to make sure that we are re-establishing our controls. There's been a failure somewhere, we need to get everything back to where it is, investigate what went wrong to prevent it from happening again, and look at replenishing our resources so that we've got our spill kits redone, just as a common example there. If we've got waste that needs to be disposed of, your emergency plan should outline who your contractors that you use are. Not just say, call a disposal contractor. Have the specifics there so that you know who to call to get that sorted. Our plan needs to specify where we can find information about the substances. So this would include safety data sheets, but also specific procedures and other resources that you might have to respond there. It could be a third-party service or a supplier as well. How to contact emergency service providers, and looking at the purpose and location of our equipment and facilities. So what equipment is needed to respond to these emergencies? And sometimes it's only implied in what you will do. So in the event of a fire, you will probably say evacuate, but there'll also be information about using fire extinguishers and making sure that we know what type of extinguishers are around, that people know how to use them properly, that they are the right type for the substances that we're dealing with. And spill kits as well, that not all absorbent materials are suitable for every hazardous substance. Whole range of equipment that could be covered here, your drain covers, your sprinkler systems, decontamination equipment, so whether that's for decontaminating people who have responded with showers and that sort of thing, and also cleaning up the spilled area, cleaning up your surfaces. And if you're needing a decontamination shower for someone who has got substances on them, what happens to them afterwards? Have you got somewhere that's got some privacy where they can take off their contaminated clothing, put on something that's clean and dry? Have you got some clean and dry spare clothing available for that? The location of shut-off valves is also really important, and I find the most useful plans for these have in them photos of where these valves are sitting. of what they look like when they're open and what they look like when they're in the closed position, so that there's no confusion as to what's happening. It should all be very clearly understandable to someone looking at something. Our plan needs to describe what actions we need to take. So what is suitable or not suitable in some situations? Are there any actions that shouldn't be taken in some situations as well? And what are the consequences? So if you do need to shut down power for some reason, what does that mean? Is there a sequence of actions that needs to be undertaken? So these are things that need to be in our plan, and when we're testing them, we're asking these questions over and over. What's next? What happens if? Another frequently asked question, do I have to have an emergency shower? If you're looking at the regulations and for storage of corrosive substances in Part 13, there are some situations where it mandates that you need to have an emergency shower. But if it's, for example, when we're looking at location certification, it's not actually required for the storage of closed packages. But your emergency procedures are very likely to say that in the event of a failure, if someone puts a forklift through an IBC, then you would want to have a sufficient supply of running water to treat that person, and an emergency shower would be ideal. So while the regulations don't specify that you have to have one, when you think about the likely emergencies and the equipment that you need to respond to them, the answer is probably yes in that situation. Our plan needs to identify the people involved, who's responsible for doing particular things. So if you've got individuals or particular roles that have responsibilities, we need to know who they are and how to contact them. The plan should describe which skills they need to have, any specialised training, and the actions that they're expected to take. So this, for example, might be your certified handlers, your first aiders, and specialist response teams that can go in and perhaps do rescue. And then the last component to our content of our emergency response plan is sort of looking at information. So your emergency response plan also needs to have an inventory of your hazardous substances, and your inventory, when you go back through the regs, also needs to include your safety data sheets and make sure that they're up to date, that the maximum quantities likely reflect what's on site, that the location for your substances in your inventory is correctly described or easily described, that it matches the name given to the store or the location on your site plan. The plan needs to detail the type and the location of your fire extinguishers and other firefighting equipment. So this is particularly specified that it needs to identify these things. If you've got oxidizing or organic peroxides, then there are specific actions that you need to take in responding to those spills, making sure that they are decontaminated. Oxidizing and organic peroxide substances can easily react when you've got organic matter nearby. So if there's sawdust or leaves or dust or debris, and if they're not cleaned up straight away, those can start to react and fume slowly over time, but that can accelerate. And your emergency response plan needs to include a site plan. This needs to be accurate and fit for the purpose of responding and being helpful in an emergency. When we do location certification and we require a site plan, there's only a handful of specific things that need to be on that site plan. If you go and have a look at the emergency response flip chart that I mentioned earlier that WorkSafe put out, they have a section in there about the sorts of information that could be useful on your site plan in an emergency. The North Point, knowing the orientation, where the switchboard is, where the isolation valves are, there's a lot of useful information that can be on your emergency response flip charts. On your site plans. One of the things that's mentioned there is the drains, where they are, where they go to. If you've got any drains on your site that you know go straight to a waterway, then you want to make sure you've got steps in place to cut that off before they get there. Imagine the scenario that an emergency is happening on site and you've got FENS on site to respond. And so you're talking with one of the officers there, you've given them the site plan of your property. How much explanation would you need to give them for them to get the key information that they need to respond to this hazardous substance emergency? Is your site plan self-explanatory, or is it complicated to an extent that actually there's too much information on it or it's not clear? If you start putting all this information onto one plan, it is going to get complicated. So when you've got site plans, having sets of plans that clearly identify this is our fire information, our alarm panels, our sprinklers, our extinguishers. And then we've got one that relates to spills or to essential services. That can be much more useful if they're clearly identified than having too much information in one place. Our plans need to be available and the equipment and the facilities need to be available. So when you have your emergency response plan, you need to make sure that all the equipment and the facilities that have been identified in it are present where they're supposed to be. So if it says that there's a spill kit in the warehouse A, we want to be checking that it's actually there, that the components of it are all in good condition and ready to be used. If there are facilities or people that are available within a specific time, because emergencies don't happen always during working hours, so your plan might identify that certain key personnel, if they're not on site, are able to respond or to provide assistance either in person or on the phone within a given amount of time. Will that actually work? And the plan needs to be available to people with responsibilities in it. It's not helpful at all if you've got a plan that says, in an emergency, Janet is going to deal with everything. If you don't give Janet a copy of that plan, she's not going to know what you expect and the emergency is not going to be properly dealt with. The plan also needs to be made available to emergency services when they arrive or when they're on site there. So it's a wee bit different that FENS need to be given an opportunity to review your plan because you want them to do stuff, but you also need to make sure that you've got copies of the plan available to people who are responding. So while you don't have to have a printed copy of your plan, you do need to think about what the availability of it is. If there's no power to go online, if there's no internet service, or if it's happening after hours and so someone has turned up to respond to a problem on your site, does that information need to be available in an emergency information box that FENS can access when they arrive on site? So that's sort of it for what needs to be in an emergency response plan. I'm going to talk next about the next part of testing our plan, and this is going to be how we're testing. There are many, many ways we can test our plan, and these can and should vary. You shouldn't be doing the same thing over and over again. So you can do exercise and drills, you can do walkthroughs on your site, you can do a tabletop exercise, you can run a full scenario. You might be able to get FENS involved depending on the nature of your site, the availability and the resourcing of them. That's not something that you'd want to do every year, but it could be very useful in working with FENS for your particular hazards there. Having an external observer on site, a third set of eyes, can be really helpful to ask some of those picky questions about that and say, well, we'll get our spill kit. Where's your spill kit? How do I use it? What do I do with it when it's finished? And that's something that I've done in the past for people as well. It's just being present while you're running through some of these scenarios. A combination of these will actually be needed because you need to check details like contact details, making sure those are all up to date. That's easy enough to do with a tabletop or a document review. But get people together, get people who are involved with the substances as part of your testing. Don't just keep it part of a management exercise. And to be most effective, don't try and do it all at once. If you can stagger the testing of your emergency response plan throughout the year, then you're not overloading people with information all at once. You're not trying to get it all rushed in just because the certifier is coming. So for an example, if you need to do a trial evacuation twice a year, then you'll do that. And you might want to tack onto that at the same time, run through what you do for an LPG leak or what you would do for fire response that's beyond evacuation. Get your spills done through as well in a timely manner. You can do them in so many different ways, and we'll talk about documenting it as we go down. But trying to do it all at once tends to lead to things not being done as thoroughly as they could do. If you're doing it to meet a deadline, then you're not necessarily giving it as much thought as it deserves. Another frequent question we get is, does my trial evacuation count? And partly, evacuation is a standard response of what to do in a fire. And we do need to practice that. We'll ask for records of your trial evacuation. But it's not the only thing you will do in a fire. Well, it might be. Some sites do specifically say, in the event of a fire, just get out. But most plans will say something like this. So this is an excerpt from that WorkSafe Flipchart again. And so if it's a fire, first of all, if it's too large, just get out. We need to raise the alarm. We need to evacuate everyone from the area. And then it starts talking about if it's safe to do so. Activate the emergency stop, isolate the power, isolate processes that could be triggering gas or flammable liquids into the area, and use your fire extinguisher to contain and extinguish the fire. So if your emergency response plan is including this information, then your testing relating to fire should have evacuation, but also making sure people know where the emergency stops are, making sure that people know how to assess whether it's safe, that they know how to use a fire extinguisher there. So many more steps that come into play than just evacuation, but it is possible that is the only thing you would do in a given scenario. In a similar line, we get the question, here's my spill training. Now, the purpose of spill training is usually about teaching people how to respond to a spill. So this can quite possibly form part of your emergency response plan testing. But our emergency response plan testing is about testing the practicality, the workability of our emergency response plan. So if you're doing some spill training, make sure that it is linked into what your actual emergency procedures say. So it could be based on training, the training based on your emergency response plan, or reviewing your procedures alongside the training that's being given there. As I said earlier, we're wanting to get that match between our people and our procedures. When we are thinking about incidents or emergencies that happen, we tend to think of them in isolation, but multiple factors are probably just as likely to compound things. So you could have a single incident, you've got a response that's very easy to deal with. You might have a spill scenario, but what happens if that spill happens when it's pouring with rain, or there's high winds, or other factors that could be occurring at the same time, just as a matter of coincidence? You've got factors that start to relate to each other. So you've got a leak or a spill that's now caught fire. That changes things. If you are in a remote location, and so the response time from emergency services is longer and there's limited resources around, then you'll need to make sure that the resource that you've got yourself on site is sufficient to deal with your own emergency. Your hazardous substance emergency could have been triggered by an external event like an earthquake or a flood. and in which case there could be the resources that you're wanting to rely on could be limited availability. If FENS are out responding to people at risk of life from an emergency, floods, earthquakes, then they're not there to support your hazardous substance emergency. If there's something widespread, then the resources that you would use or that you would go and get from another party might become scarce. So thinking about these scenarios, not every time you do an emergency response plan test, but from time to time can help you identify gaps in your planning. You might recognise the sequence of events. So this was 2011 in Fukushima. They had an earthquake, which triggered a tsunami, which led to the loss of power. And there was loss of backup power, and then a loss of coolant, which led to a nuclear meltdown and explosions and release of radiation. And so it wasn't a problem at the nuclear plant, but the events triggered by that earthquake led to a huge disaster. And the last part around our testing our emergency response plan relates to record keeping. You can do testing all you like, but if you don't keep a record of it, who's going to know how you're going to demonstrate that you've done it? So you need to keep records of when you've done the test and how you've done it, what the outcomes and any actions required were, and the changes that you've implemented as a result of that test. There's multiple ways you can do this, and over the years we've developed forms that are available for use and modification as well. So at a very basic level, on the trial evacuation report that you would submit to FENS after your evacuation, you can use the additional comments field on that form to record other scenarios that you may have covered. So that gives you a single document that says, I've done my trial evacuation, and at the same time we went through what we would do in the event of a gas leak, and we checked where the isolation valves were, and people knew what to do, and they've got the right gas supplier's number there. So for small things that you're doing at the same time, just recording that information in that part of the form is sufficient. If you are using the WorkSafe Flipchart, then there is a page at the back there for keeping a record of your plan testing, that you're able to contact the right people, that you've covered fires, spills, first aid. If you've got LPG or other gases, make sure that you're very clear that you've covered gas leak as one of these scenarios. And then if there are issues identified, making sure you are making those modifications that have been identified. This is the most recent version of the emergency response plan testing form that we've prepared here at Chem Safety. A copy will be sent out after the webinar to you and also available on our website. So the first couple of pages are a brief summary of this webinar, the information that's needed and why we're testing. And I thought, just as a wee exercise, I'd have a look through an example of someone completing this. So we need to know who we are and where we are. We've got the version of the plan that we're testing. Make sure we know which version it is, what the version and the date of it is, so that can all be traced. We're checking who's been given copies of this plan. So in this example, it's available to all staff on SharePoint, and we submitted it to FENS there. We might also want to look at where printed copies are. Of course, it looks at where printed copies are. It's on the next section. So the physical printed copies are located in the folder in the foyer, in the health and safety office, in the production office. So when emergency services come to site, you would expect them to be able to access the folder in the foyer there. We want to make sure that we've checked that these printed copies are of the latest version, and they're actually in a physical format that's able to be used, so they haven't got damp or the pages don't flip nicely or something like that. We need to record which hazardous substances we have on site are actually triggering our hazardous substance emergency response plan. So in this example, we've identified it's the LPG, the flammable liquids, and the corrosives that are over our threshold. It's a really good idea to record if you've had any incidents that have occurred. An actual incident is a great test of your emergency response plan. It's not the recommended way of doing it, but if you have had an incident, make sure you are doing a great review to learn from it and document that it's happened and that your plan worked. You wouldn't want to put the full details here, but you would have an incident report that you can refer to. Have we checked whether there's any changes in our personnel since our last test? Do we need to update the emergency response plan? It can be tricky if your emergency response plan is too personalised. So it's a really good idea of sort of right near the front, you identify the key roles in it in your plan, and then who the current person in that role is. And then you only need to update those people at the front without it saying, in 14 different places throughout the plan that, Janet's going to do this. Making sure that personnel involved in responding in emergencies have received the training that's needed. And making sure that our contact details are all up to date, including your personnel, the contractors that you might use, so your electricians, your plumbers, your disposal contractors, and your neighbours who you'd need to notify in an emergency. Checking our documentation, that it's all included with the ERP and available. So in this little scenario, the safety data sheets weren't kept there. And then looking at the scenario that we're actually running, what date we're doing it, how we're doing it, a description of what we're doing. And when you're getting into more detailed scenarios or exercises, you're probably going to have a separate document for that, who the people involved are. And if you're not testing particular scenarios on the day, it's a thought as an option as to recording when they're last tested. They'll give you an idea of what you need to do next, or next time you do one. We've identified the equipment that was there. We found some spill kits that weren't shown in an emergency response plan. We found that something else was missing, but we've fixed it. We've checked that they're all in good order. We've tested our emergency shower and eye wash. We needed to get it serviced. Our fire extinguisher all in test. Noticed that the signage for our isolation valve was fading and needed to be replaced. So all these sorts of things are checks that are done as part of our test here. And a separate debrief report can be done, or you can type it up in this form here. So that's what I wanted to cover today. I wanted to identify the importance and value of having an emergency response plan and testing it to make sure it's workable in a schedule that works for you and is not tied necessarily to a deadline of when an inspection's being done, because that leads to things being rushed. I'll have a look at the questions that have come through shortly, and I see that there are some there. But as I said earlier, you can catch up on all Chem Safety's webinars on our YouTube channel. There's quite a number of them going through there now, so yeah, do certainly have a look at those. If you've got questions relating to this or any other subject that we deal with, just give us a call. Our contact details will be in the email that comes out, and yeah, we're always available to answer your questions. So we'll have a look at the questions that have come up. Thank you for your attendance, and let's see what we've got. Does your service cover the emergency response plan? Does your service cover testing with the emergency response plan with the PCBU? Absolutely. We're happy to talk to you about what's going to work for you for testing your emergency response plan. As I said, that third set of eyes can be so valuable there. Question, I'm doing an ISO 45001 safety management for a client. They're next to a major facility that has a big ammonia plant. They've requested a copy of the emergency information. They've said it's confidential. How to approach that issue? If it's a major hazard facilities are notified and need to have safety cases there. I'm not quite sure what the next step in that engagement would be, but I can certainly have a chat with you if you wanted to send me an email or give me a call later. We could look at some examples there. Question, For a PCBU with multiple unmanned sites across New Zealand, can the ERP give the contact details to a central call centre, or does the plan need to give contact details to a specific person or both? It's about making sure that the level of information and the availability works. So if the central call centre has the experienced people there and they know the details of the site to give through there, as you say, it's an unmanned site, there's not going to be people there. It's probably better for a central call centre in some cases, not knowing the specifics of it, because they would then you'll be able to give the updated details of the specific person to the call centre and they can forward that through. That's a common scenario that you get there, making sure that the information's there. Can we have copies of the ERP with variations depending on the area? I can think of a scenario that may or may not be what you're thinking of, but you might have a site that's got multiple production areas and you've got warehousing and storage and transport facilities. And so you've got an emergency response plan that covers the whole site, but you might have a series of, take flip charts as examples that say this is the production procedure and this is the warehouse procedure and this is the workshop procedure, because those are specific to those areas. And I think that's perfectly valid. It gives the information at the point of where those substances are to be the most relevant to that area, but you've got the overarching one that's got all the details that can be used as well. So it's a part of it, and that area specific one would make reference to the fact that for more details, go to the full document. And then it's got frequency of testing should be at least yearly or twice a year. So the minimum requirement in the regulations is that it's at least every 12 months for a hazardous substance emergency response plan. So it should be at least yearly. Whether you, and I said earlier, don't try and do it all at once. If you can stage it out so that over the course of 12 months, you've covered the key aspects, that would be great. And the other question part of that is 3 months post changes. It needs to be a significant change, or you're testing the part of it that's changed. So if you've made a change to your emergency procedures, then you're wanting to make sure that we're testing that what's changed is actually workable. So the example given in the question is about inventory changes. So if you're looking at a change, an incremental change in the quantity of a substance, then probably not. If you've got a new substance, or you've suddenly quadrupled the amount or 100 times the amount that you've got, then that might trigger a change. Or if your inventory has changed so that a new class of substance is now over the threshold, then that would probably be a significant enough change to look at that. So I think that's it for the questions that we've got. Thank you so much for your attendance. And as I say, give me a call if there's anything else we can do to help you.